Across the globe, justice systems are being reimagined through trauma-informed care, desistance theory, and neuroscience. At the forefront of this movement stands a voice for change, a trainer of professionals, and a storyteller committed to evidence-based reform. This is The Criminologist, the podcast exploring the people, the practices, and the possibilities shaping a more humane justice system. And now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello and welcome to episode 246 of The Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. We live in a time when crime is not simply reported. It is packaged, streamed, analyzed, debated, dramatized, and increasingly consumed as entertainment. A high-profile case can move from a crime scene to a television studio, a podcast feed, a documentary series, and millions of social media accounts almost overnight. And that raises some important questions. Why are we so fascinated by serious crime? When does public attention help us better understand violence? And when does it risk turning tragedy into spectacle? What happens to victims and survivors when the person responsible for the crime becomes the most recognizable name in the story? And what responsibility do criminologists, educators, journalists, and justice professionals have when they enter that public conversation? Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Criminologist Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Arvidson. My guest today is Dr. Debbie Goodman, a criminologist, professor, published author, media contributor, and host of Crime Time with Dr. Debbie. Dr. Goodman has spent decades educating future justice professionals and helping the broader public understand crime and the criminal justice system. She has provided commentary on high-profile cases involving serial murder, mass violence, familicide, juvenile offending, and other serious forms of crime. But today's conversation is not simply about revisiting disturbing cases. It's about learning how to examine them responsibly. I have been looking forward to dropping this episode ever since my conversation with Debbie. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Debbie Goodman, and I'll see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Debbie. So glad to have you here on the Criminologist Podcast. As I traditionally do with my guest, I like to kick it off with asking them to briefly introduce themselves, more as a way to highlight what their professional trajectory was like. And I've got to say, Debbie, when I was looking at your bio, I thought, okay, I cannot wait to hear Dr. Goodman's bio, because as we're going to unpack during the course of this podcast, you have such a, I don't know if hybrid is the right word, eclectic, fascinating, enriching bundle of skills and talents that appear on your sort of life's resume that I am genuinely curious myself. Tell us what experiences you collected along the way, Debbie, and welcome to the show, by the way, to tell us where you landed in this great spot in your life you're at now, doing such great deeds.
Well, thank you, Joe, for the kind words and for having me as a guest on the show. I'm a big fan of the Criminologist Podcast, and so delighted to speak with you and your viewers. So I would say professionally, I wear three hats: criminologist, professor, author. As a criminologist, I get to interact with professionals such as yourself in the true crime space, I speak on national media platforms about high profile crimes and cases. So that's a lot of fun. In terms of being a professor, that's been my primary career. I get to work with our undergraduate and graduate students here in Florida and get them excited about contributions they'll make. And in terms of being an author, I'm just so passionate about our field, and I love to research, read, and write. So I've had the opportunity to write 7 books. And in terms of how did all of this start, and I know that's a question perhaps you and I spoke about at the intro, and my students ask me through the years, how does one become, what I become? Well, interestingly, I would tell you I wasn't 100% sure when I was in college what I wanted to do. And yes, I was thinking more along the traditional lines of being an attorney. We have a lot of attorneys and judges in the family. But something very interesting happened, Joe, when I was 19, just a couple of years ago, right? When I was an undergrad student, and always a good student, always punctual. I came to class very early. So one Wednesday morning, class starts at 9. I'm sitting in the lobby area at 7:30 in the morning. And my professor came out, looking pretty startled and frantic, and saw me and said, "Debbie, I have an emergency. I have to leave." A class back then, Joe, was 250 students. And he said, "Do you think you could teach the class for me?" Well, it was right, exactly. I'm 9 and, all these students. But of course, I saw there was something of urgency going. Didn't want to disappoint him. So I said, "Yes, professor." Of course, it was on juvenile crime and delinquency. I had about an hour to prepare, and it was an hour and a half class. So long story short, I taught the class, went over some cases, some theory and whatnot. And I just decided to ask the students, you know what, can you please just take out a piece of paper? Don't put your name, but maybe just a few observations so the professor knows we went through class. So sure enough, they did that, put that in a folder, slipped it under his door. And I guess the next class day or two after class, he said, "Gee, do you have a minute to come to my office?" I said, "Yes, of course." So he said, "Did you read these evaluations from the students?" I said, "No, professor, I did not." So he proceeded to go over them with me. They were very favorable, Joe. So I was delighted that at least, I didn't get booed out of the classroom. And he then proceeded to tell me, "I usually don't do this, but I'd like to have you be my teaching assistant. Usually that's something that a graduate student would do." And I was still undergrad. He said, "Would you be interested?" I said, "Yes, of course." So, Joe, can you imagine that one experience then really led to what I would ultimately do for the next several decades? And that's when I decided I wanted to be a criminal justice professor.
What an amazing story, and what an awesome illustration of, in the desistance from crime literature, what we call those turning points, as you just mentioned. It can be one individual, one opportunity, one turning point that is going to alter that individual's criminal trajectory or pathway. And you just illustrated how I'm always preaching there's no them, there's only us. We're all sort of cut from the same cloth. But yeah, it can take just one person or one opportunity to alter that trajectory. And I just love your passion for teaching, which I can relate to. I taught for plus 20 years at a couple of local universities here in Minnesota, one at the undergraduate level, one at the grad level. And there is just such a great joy in that. And then I'm sure you can also relate. I always viewed it when I was still in the field, in the criminal justice field, of what better way to sort of stay at the forefront of what's going on in any given profession than to teach it. I tell folks, when I look back at the first syllabi that I created, it was just sort of a how-to manual, basically, for on-the-job training. And I was teaching an undergraduate course on probation and parole, and it was very mechanical, Debbie. It was just, do this, sort of like a day in the life. And then the more that the emerging trends in research sort of pushed me to question what I was teaching, my class evolved, and I realized what I'm teaching them during a 15-week undergraduate course, if they get hired by an agency, they're going to learn that in the first 2 weeks, right? I'm not really preparing them for what they need to succeed. So I started really to lean into the evidence-based practices and the research coming out. And when I reflect back at what my classes look like at the tail end, they were more like criminology classes and behavioral science classes. And I was imparting upon my students, yes, you're an officer of the court, but you're so much more, and just keep that curiosity going. I digress. That was a great story that you told. And it illustrates the point too, that I'm sure you're aware of what they call Bloom's taxonomy of learning, but the higher you go up that pyramid, and at the top of the pyramid or near the top is the level of comprehension reflective of, well, if you can teach this subject versus just understand it and regurgitate it, that's that higher level. So it was sort of a 2-track motivation to keep me going, both to get those nice adjunct faculty paychecks, but also to grow professionally and really force me to stay on top of everything, which I would not have done just collecting the paycheck in the field.
Right. And I think when I tell my students the story, Joe, and your story as well is fascinating, and all of your guests, but it also shows that we may be on one path, and then we do that particular role well and other opportunities open up. So that's something I really do try to instill in the students when they tell me they want to be an FBI agent or DEA, Customs, Marshal, Secret Service, and they want to go that path. But you just never know. You could do a variety of things. But the bottom line, one of my mantras, of course, with my students is always about CPR. I tell them that it's very, very important, in my humble opinion, regardless of with whom we're interacting, whether it's a janitor, a judge, a student, a senator, plumber, politician, that in our field, we should really be mindful of CPR, treating everybody with courtesy, professionalism, and respect. And that's key.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I could talk about this topic forever, but what you said about instilling in your students that lens of look for opportunities. I'll never forget, and we've all heard this oft cited statistic about most professionals will change their job at least 5 times after they leave college. And I remember getting out of graduate school with my master's degree in criminal justice administration, very proud, thinking, yeah, this is it. This is my life course. And I can remember thinking, there's no way. I'm not going to change careers. There's no way. But if you would have told the person walking down that aisle, commencement, that I'd be sitting in my home podcast studio and or training and traveling internationally and speaking, I would have thought, well, that wasn't their career path. That was penciled out when I got out of graduate school in 1988. Dear God, am I getting old, Debbie? Let's talk more about your work. I know amongst the many hats you wear, you have the opportunity to discuss and analyze a lot of high-profile cases. In fact, I think I just saw something you may have posted recently about Rex, whose last name I always mispronounce.
Oh, yes.
Rex Huberman.
Yeah.
Huberman. So why, on the one hand, do you think that the public is so drawn to those cases? I mean, I'm sure a lot of it is just sort of the sort of morbid curiosity, fascination with it. But do you think that's harmful, and or how could individuals such as you or I leverage that curiosity and look for some value-added opportunities to educate the public or to disempower stereotypes or biases that they may have about that population or any population, I guess, of justice-impacted individuals?
Sure. No, I like that question, Joe, and thank you. I think it's always critical, regardless of what case we're talking about, serial murder, mass murder, singular, double, quadruple homicide, family-based, intimate partner violence. There's so many categories upon us, but I always want to ensure that we're not sensationalizing. We're not somehow turning fact to fiction, because people really are drawn to it. We know that. And we appreciate, though, I certainly do, the true crime community, because I think that their role is so important in our criminal justice system. Why? Because we will have more eyes, more ears, more participation, and hopefully leading to solving a lot of these crimes. I remember when the Idaho quadruple murder took place, and Brian Koberger, and just the atrocity of our 4 victims, Maddie Kaylee, Ethan Zana, and one of the platforms contacted me 6 days after this and said, Dr. Debbie, do you think you could come on and talk about who might we be looking for? So sure enough, we went down what I thought potentially could be the type of individual. And it was pretty closely aligned, Joe, with with who turned out to be the killer. And then we go on this charade with him for 3 years. He's maintaining his innocence, right? And then dissecting all of the behavioral characteristics. So the first part of your question is the why. Why are people so fascinated? Because it really is a very unusual part of human behavior. And for many of us, whether in the field or outside of the field, it becomes hard to understand and you mentioned Rex Huberman, and thank you, but how could an architect, a husband, a father who's seemingly, well adjusted and a part of society kill 8 people? So I think these are the moments in time when we could be thoughtful, when we could be compassionate and considerate, because that's another key part, Joe. We understand that people are so fascinated by the killers, but I never want to lose sight of the victims and the victimology, because you and I know with victimology, we'll just quickly remind your viewers, but there are those 3 levels, right? Primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary victim, the individual himself or herself directly impacted by the crime. Secondary victimization, the family members and the trauma, the depths of despair that they endure. But then the tertiary, of course, would be the rest of us, society, who's still absolutely shocked, outraged, saddened by what's happened. So it's a multitude of areas, but no doubt about it, it's a very fascinating field that we're in.
As you spoke about the impact, and I guess the value added is a good way to put it, of sort of increasing that online, if you will, or that community of individuals. You talked about the case in Idaho. It reminded me also of the Golden State Killer, even though he was eventually apprehended via DNA. But I recall before the case was solved, there was a massive community of these sort of online detectives bringing awareness to that horrible, horrible crime spree. How do you think we balance, or what is the responsibility to balance, again, that legitimate need to inform the public, but avoid those easy to fall into sort of salacious traps of, well, they're all monsters, they're all the same. I remember when I was teaching, I would always drop the statistic on students and sometimes practitioners and stakeholders that as a population of offenders, if we break down, for example, property offenders, drug-related offenders, et cetera, gang members, whomever, I said, as a broad population of offenders, as heinous as the offenses are, sex offenders as a class of offenders have the statistically lowest rate of recidivism. Mm-hmm. But the public tends to think, because they see the high-profile serial rapist, stranger on stranger, which again, we know through the data that the vast, in the 90 percentile of sex offense victims know the perpetrator.
Right.
But on the one hand, I'm getting to the question of, how do we balance that awareness in these communities, but do so in a way that doesn't unintentionally distort that population to the point of it being counterintuitive, I guess. In other words, how do we avoid that? Yep, we want public awareness. We want you to know what drives crime, which is what I do in the show here by breaking it down into, those common risk factors, the data, et cetera. But again, as you said, I think it's just human nature. That's why they're drawn to it. So how have you sort of balanced those two concepts?
Sure. I think the balance is really staying in the lane of the fact-based information, because again, thanks to you and your podcast and media platforms and really excellent journalists who that's the goal. You're reporting on the facts. Now, clearly it's up to the viewers. They get to decide what they want to believe, but you're so on point, Joe, with the issues of social media. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing per se, but I am saying that sometimes information gets disseminated so quickly, and in 60 seconds or less, we have thousands of people already voicing opinions, yet we haven't even determined the facts yet. So you're right. There could be this salacious headline, and now everybody's deciding which side they're on. So I try to stay as true to the process as I can, meaning as a criminologist, I like to look at, obviously, we've all been taught the 5 W's and the H, but I want to stay in that lane. Let's line up all the facts first. Yes, it is important to get experts to give opinion based on their knowledge through the years of who do they think we're looking for and why. And then, of course, I'm sure we'll get to the questions about just advances in our field of DNA, genetic genealogy. You and I know, and going through our educational and training processes, as have your other guests, that people lie. We could be looking right in the eyes of a mass murderer or serial killer, and they'll say, oh, it wasn't me. You got the wrong guy. Well, guess what? Thankfully, we have DNA, genetic genealogy, and that doesn't lie. So we look at all of the tools available. We stay true to the ethics of our field. We don't want to get, any type of grandiosity too far ahead of the game. But it is a balancing act, because we're balancing true ethical journalism with potentially the fiction-based approaches that are among us. And that's okay, because that's entertainment. But when we're really dealing with trying to solve a case, it shouldn't be entertaining. We don't need to inform the public in 60 seconds or less. We got to take our time, and cases are not solved like on TV in 30 minutes or less.
Yes. And speaking of that, of cases not being solved on TV in 30 minutes or less, ironically, when I was reflecting on and preparing for this interview last night in my home office here, I recalled from my aforementioned undergraduate teaching days, I was asked to put together a course on criminal justice in the media. And as I often did back then, when I was looking at a blank slate to fill out a syllabus, I thought, well, find the textbook you're going to use first, Joe, and then you can sort of reverse engineer the syllabus through that. I'd almost forgotten about this textbook, Debbie, entitled Media, Crime, and Criminal Justice, Images and Realities by Ray Surratt.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I am such a nerd, Debbie. You can see it, but, I still have the Post-it notes and the highlighting from all the cool stuff I found. This book was so fascinating, but now it's so spot on to what you just brought up. I just, out of curiosity, looked last night at, well, what was so important, Joe, that you bookmarked this? And I was going down this rabbit hole talking about the echo effect, which, as you know, story splashes on the headlines, all the other 24/7 media outlets pick up on it. But it creates this perception that, oh, this crime is rampant, it's ubiquitous. It's like, no, it's just in the 24-hour news cycle here. Reminds me of a story that I would tell in class teaching this, how years and years and years ago, there was a particularly slow news summer. And so the journalists, the media, the networks are all looking for anything to report on, because there just wasn't a lot going on. Things were going pretty good for us back then. And then if I tell you when, it'll spoil it. But it got to the point that the biggest shared news stories this particular summer were about shark attacks off the east coast of the United States.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine all these news stories start running. People go to the beach. It's the whole reticular activation syndrome, or RAS, where if I say to you shark, that's yellow Volkswagen, that's all you're going to see. Yeah. So that summer, it was all about sharks. And after the fact, someone did the research and said, I looked at this. There was not a spike in shark attacks that summer. There was just nothing else to report on.
Interesting.
Until something interesting happened on 9/11. That was the summer before 9/11. When, if you think about it, this was early 90s. We weren't in any foreign conflicts. Economically, we're getting ready for the .com. Things were good. So the media is just reporting on sharks, and we all thought, it's all about shark attacks. And then, like I said, 9/11 happened, and that all got pushed to the side. But
sure,
I'm relating this to the echo effect. And in crime, we have to watch out for, if you just bombard your viewers, they're going to get a skewed perception of what's going on there.
Right. And Joe, if I may add to that, then we also become desensitized, because students will ask me all the time, well, Dr. Debbie, you've done so many cases, so many issues that you've dealt with that it just must not be shocking to you anymore. And I say, no, that's not true. Every case is startling, is shocking, is important. I never want to become desensitized to this, Joe. These are real human beings going through horrific trauma, and they deserve the voice, and for our criminal justice system to navigate their case with the utmost, again, integrity and time, energy, effort to where we can bring justice to these families and have closure and resolution.
And to that end, Debbie, and you mentioned it earlier, the notion of victimology. So in high-profile cases, how well do you think the victims and survivors are represented in media coverage, and what do you think sometimes we get wrong?
Right. Well, I think the first thing that we will hear about on the headline is the case, the horror potentially of what happened, especially if it is an unlawful planned death. Usually the types of cases I speak about are in the category of first-degree murder, as your viewers well know and are well versed on the issues, meaning it was something planned, premeditated, willful with malice. So we start there. So it's, I think, the shock of the case first. Then usually what happens is, as you mentioned, the media and the reporting, then we try to figure out who did it, right? Who are we looking for, potentially profiling the individual, or if it's plural. But Joe, I have found, and you know this to be true as well, because a lot of the networks ask me, well, Dr. Debbie, this is before we know who did what to whom. Are we looking for a singular person? Are we looking for more than one? But we know the data that when it is a mass or serial murder, it's usually a singular individual. So we start there, mainly because we know these people have that sense of grandiosity and narcissism, and they don't want to necessarily take on a co-defendant and such. But then I think, to your point about the victims, we need to understand who the victims are, because that also helps solve the crime, right? We know victimology 101. The more we know about the victim, then the more we know potentially of whom are we looking to identify as the perpetrator. So again, it's a balancing act, but I feel particularly at these different points in time of the criminal justice system, and usually when I get involved in a case, it's like A to Z. It's the starting point of we don't even know who did it. Then we have the identification. Then we need to build and what evidence do we have? And obviously bringing it to closure means not only the arrest, but the conviction and the incarceration. And that's your world too, of your expertise in corrections. So with that said, even though we can never really, because we talk about victim restoration, right? Making the victim whole again. We know it's a theory, but I think the reality part to that is when victims feel that the criminal justice system got it right, meaning they've been informed, the agents, the officers have communicated with family. We do know who did it, going through the process. And I think in many instances, the victims' voices, if it's the decedent, clearly they can't represent. But when victims' families come to the courtroom, give the victim impact statement, that's critical. That's a very healing part to this process.
Yeah, it truly, truly is. I want to change subjects a little bit, because I know you speak a lot on juvenile offenders, and this is something that personally, I shouldn't say I've struggled with, but I've experienced this from different perspectives. One of the hats that I wore before retiring as a probation officer, I supervised gang members. So I had exposure to a lot of juvenile gang members, and I saw the harm done in the community and the real harm done. And then I also juxtapose that with what I know about neuroscience and how the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed until 25, 26. And so I try to balance those two things, the legitimate harm that's going on in that population against what I know about the science. So maybe give us your elevator speech, if that's possible, on your experiences and some of your perspectives, particularly around what the public doesn't understand or does understand about juvenile crime.
Right. So I mentioned, I've authored 7 books, one of which is on juvenile crime and delinquency. And it just so happens, back to that early story, as the 19-year-old, the class I taught for the professor was juvenile crime and delinquency. So yes, it is an area that I'm very passionate about. But I would even say, Joe, that too becomes the fine line, right? I know it's difficult, and this is really how I start the classes, even with my students on juvenile crime and delinquency. So I give them different ages. I say, okay, we're going to have offenders, and then we go through almost 5 offenders, if you will. I say we'll have an offender who's 7, who's 17, 27, 47, 87. So 5 different people. And then I say, but here's the offense. The offense is each of whom has committed murder. And then I break them into groups and I ask them to evaluate and analyze the ages and how would they proceed as criminal justice practitioners or as lawyers or forensic psychologists. So it's a very interesting exercise to just start the class of what the dynamic is about the different ages. So with the 7-year-old, many of the students say, you know what, just too young to fully understand and appreciate the wrongfulness. Many students say we need to have parental liability in those issues because where's the parent? And especially if there's access to a weapon and such, that they want to hold the parent accountable. So now the 17-year-old becomes the interesting age, right? And I found that through the years, many of the students feel that when it's first degree murder, that the person still, do they appreciate the wrongfulness of the act? Do they understand? Clearly, they still have to get a mental acuity test. But for the most part, 17 is an age in which many states will waive that juvenile into the adult system. 27, 47, more or less the same, that we have to make sure the individual understands and appreciates. But then here's another curious part, a little bit of our more mature member of society, the 87-year-old who might be in a circumstance of having been married 60 years. Now, the spouse is dying of a terminal illness. They don't want to see such pain and suffering and taking matters into their own hands, right? So it really does become an interesting dynamic, I think, just age of the offender and how it will impact outcome. But I have been involved in many high-profile juvenile-related cases. We had one in South Florida most recently, a 15-year-old young man, of all things, Joe, an honor student, a good young man in the community. Second marriage, the mother is now remarried, has a baby daughter, an infant, and this young man bludgeoned his own mother. So he's been tried as an adult, and it's interesting because even younger than the 17 years we're speaking, he's 15, but waived into the adult system and is going to be serving life. So it's a difficult matter. It really is. But I have to submit, I don't want to necessarily give the blanket answer. I like to truly look case by case at the facts of each case.
Yeah, I love that you added that sort of postscript of, well, I don't want to give you a blanket answer because that's clearly not the message we're trying to send and that you don't send to those students. I love that activity, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to try to think of a way to reappropriate that or to use that in some of my trainings. I just love that. I think it challenges the students, I think, and I'm certain this is your intent, to sort of challenge themselves on their own preconceived notions. And even when you spoke about the 87-year-old, because I was thinking, well, why would he commit homicide, Debbie? That doesn't make sense. And then you outlaid it for me like, oh, I could totally see that type of as you articulated, that sort of semi-mercy killing type thing.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting exercise, and you're right. We kick off the semester that way, and it's like, wow, they're already really thinking very distinctly that each case is different.
Yeah, it really is. It really, really is. So I love this theme we're having, Debbie, about an informed public and informed students and just a better understanding of what we're dealing with and just sort of adding transparency. Regular listeners of the show will know I recently interviewed Emance Mosers and Stephen Pitts, who wrote an amazing book entitled The Missing Story. And it's really all about probation and the sort of battle for public understanding. And in the book, they cite a quotation from a esteemed criminologist over in Scotland by the name of Fergus MacNeill, who leaves the story of and I can share it with you. You know, Debbie, I could drive down the road with you and point to a hospital and ask you, hey, what goes on in there? And you could tell me. And we could drive further down the road and get to a school and point to that building and say, hey, what goes on in there? And you would say, well, yeah, that's where they educate kids. I could drive the layperson down the road and point to a probation office and ask them, what goes on in there? And nobody has a freaking clue what goes on in there. Up to and including, some, I would contend, the people who go to work in that building. We need a little bit of sort of vocational role clarification. And the purpose of their book that they wrote was, if we don't get the stakeholders involved, beginning with the public and those policymakers, we're not going to be able to do a service to our communities and the clients that we serve. Are there illustrations you can think of or instances of, yep, that was a good public relations coup that you guys pulled off? And or what advice would you give to the authors here, Stephen Pitts and Iman Smoljas, of maybe things you've seen in the criminal justice field, whether it's law enforcement, for example, or prosecutions or whatnot, where, yeah, that was a good illustration. That was a good, again, bit of public relations for that field.
Yeah, I think the most important part of how I would answer that would be really starting with humanity, that we're not dealing with fiction. You know, we love books, right? I'm an author. I love to read. I love to write. I love to read other authors' books, but so many genres of what we read. But when it comes to crime, Joe, we're talking about real people, real life, real trauma, real issues. So again, I always say we don't want to mix the facts and the fiction because they're different and they have to be, thought through differently. So I like the idea when law enforcement is dealing with the public in a very humane way. And that still means the defendant innocent until proven guilty. So we may have people, we know we have people in the Innocence Project who are wrongfully arrested, accused, convicted, and such. And I'm sure in your the hat that you wear and wore in corrections, use of that too. So we don't want to get it wrong. That's something I stress to the students, that it's okay if we make a mistake, let's say here or there in different genres of life, and we're in the restaurant industry and we got the wrong meal delivered. Okay, it's not life altering. But when we talk about local, state, and federal law enforcement and fact finding and decision making, there's just no room for error. But I feel that we can minimize error when we recognize we're dealing with somebody's mother, father, husband, wife, child, as if they were our own and not just a make-believe character in the story. And bringing the humanity dynamic to it, I think, is critical with every case.
I love that. And I love the idea of doing that on almost at both sides of the aisle, but both sides of the courtroom, I guess, whether it's the victim, members of the community, the offender themselves.
Right. We got to get it right. We can't arrest and incarcerate the wrong person for 20 years.
Yeah. Speaking of getting it right, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you to talk about one of your other projects, Crime Time with Dr. Debbie. Tell your future fans, if I can shepherd some over there, what they can expect when they check out Crime Time with Dr. Debbie, and really kind of tell us, to the degree that you already haven't, if we can connect the dots, but what was the inspiration behind that, and what are you trying to accomplish with that?
Right. Well, believe it or not, I wasn't necessarily going down that path with intention, but sometimes, again, we're dealing with other issues and then an opportunity comes. So long story short there, I was invited on a radio show of a friend and colleague who's an attorney and was doing a morning show and whatnot. So I went to the studio, talked to him on his show, and I'm leaving. And then the executive producer comes out, well, who are you? And, what do you do? And what's your show? I go, oh, no, I was just a guest. Oh, no, I need you to now do your show. I said, oh, thank you, but I'm a professor and I don't really, no, we need to create something. So lo and behold, Joe, that's how that started. And it happened during COVID, which was pretty interesting. around the 2020 timeframe, where now we're literally shutting down studios and more of that silo approach and a little bit of isolationism and such. So I ended up from the home dining room talking about the cases, helping the listeners and such. And it was primarily audio, and it ended up becoming something rather popular because people were at home bored. They didn't know what to do, but we were still keeping them connected. So Crime Time with Dr. Debbie, still like what you're doing in part, bring the experts, talk the issues, whether it's one particular case that we may dissect from beginning, middle to the end, or cold cases, or just very fascinating people. I had an FBI agent on once, and it was interesting. Well, I had different FBI agents, but the one gentleman, he had been an athlete in college, a top 10 school and football player. And he was telling the story because, like you're asking me, how did I get involved? I asked him, how'd you become an FBI agent? So he thought he'd be going to the NFL and had a career-ending issue. And then was at his local restaurant and saw a group of police officers and started talking to them. Oh, gee, I'm kind of interested. Okay, great. They helped him. He became a police officer. Then he decided he wanted to segue into becoming an FBI agent. Long story short, he became an expert in Mandarin and learned this complex language, right? And then he became one of the experts in foreign counterintelligence. So it's just always fascinating to me, as I know it is to you, that people among us just have very interesting choices they've made and interesting contributions. So I do feel in our criminal justice system, the experts are so far and wide and vast, and we learn something from each person.
And that's a great illustration to Debbie to speak. And again, one of the mantras of my show is, I'm trying to get listeners and viewers to get out of this sort of binary where they look at good guys, bad guys, offenders, non-offenders, type thing, and take those labels off. And I always talk about the sort of the parallel process. Like, we're all the same. It just sort of manifests differently. And as you were speaking about your development, I was thinking, okay, this aligns perfectly with, again, drawing on what I know from desistance from crime theory. We talk about those three major factors when individuals desist from crime. And it's identity transformation, growing their human capital, their skills, their traits, their job, education, background, so to speak, and then expanding their social capital. And I tell students or people, probation corrections officers I trained, that roadmap works for your clients under supervision. And if you don't believe it, look in the mirror and ask yourselves to examine your professional, personal trajectory. And as you were speaking, Debbie, I thought, okay, that's a good illustration of how Debbie's identity transformed. And you went from being a professor to, well, I might get into media, and I'm a podcaster, and I'm a YouTuber. And along the way, right, your human capital grew, your skills, your traits, sort of your life's resume grew, and undoubtedly your social support network expanded. And when I talk about the parallel process, I'll say it's the same for somebody sitting in the Dade County Jail. If somebody asks, how's that person never going to find a crime-free life? And I would tell them, work on these three things.
Yes, Joe, that's terrific.
Improve your identity, work on your human capital and your social capital. And when folks don't believe me, I'll say, use yourself as proof of concept.
Love that. That's a great takeaway, what you said, for me to
there you go.
Incorporate with my students. I really love that. And that's why I try for them to think not just in terms of, oh, I want to do this, or I want to do this or that. Instead of the or, let's replace it with an and.
Yep.
Because why shouldn't we or couldn't we be involved in different arenas of contribution? And I think that's really what we're doing. We're contributing teaching to training. See, when I actually, just going back way back in time, I did a local TV show, and it was interesting because once again, I was somebody's guest. It happened to have been about police ethics, and at the time, I wrote a book on ethics, enforcing ethics, use at police academies and whatnot. And so I was invited to speak about it. And then something very similar happened where a very kind lady producer said, gee, you should think about TV. I said, oh, thank you, but that's really not for me. I'm a professor. I like the classroom. But she said something very interesting, Joe, that stayed with me then and now. She said, you know what, Debbie, when you get involved with TV, it's an extension of the classroom. You're still teaching, you're still training, but it's a bigger audience. And I had never thought about that, Joe, because my comfort zone was always in the classroom, 30 to 50 students, and it felt manageable. But it is true. You doing your podcast and radio, TV, whatever the platform might be, you're teaching and training quite a far-reaching audience. And that's very satisfying and gratifying, I think.
Yeah, I do too. I'm so glad I stumbled into this life that I find myself in. Debbie, look into your crystal ball. When I have you back on the podcast in 5 years, what do you think we might be talking about down the road?
Wow. Well, I think, Joe, there may be crimes that we don't even know of yet, because if we just think back to, and that's what I tell my students, evolving crimes, when I was their age, we didn't have a lot of what we have today. So I think we need to constantly hone our own skills, not only in terms of the academic skills, but awareness and just knowledge of what the criminals are doing. Because let's face it, they themselves have a lot of creativity, unfortunately, so with the types of crimes being perpetrated. So I think we'll be talking about other cases that we may not even be privy to today.
That's a great answer. I love that spin you took on that question. That is a great answer. It reminds me of another mantra of mine that I always say in training or site, and you can relate to this as well. But when you're talking about looking for the ever-changing landscape or the things we do, as an evidence-based practice trainer, the words that will make my head explode, Debbie, is when someone says to me, well, Joe, we've always done it this way. We've always done it this way. How many times, just if we look at, you mentioned the pandemic and the lockdowns, but just look at how that concept was shattered with the lockdowns, the whole we've always done it this way. But I think it challenges us then to also look for, as you were just articulating, those new challenges ahead of us, and don't make assumptions that, crime will always be manifested as X, Y, Z.
No.
As drive-by shootings is going to be tell that to the folks who have been ripped off in a Bitcoin Ponzi scheme. Exactly. Or tell that to the person who had their identity stolen. When I was teaching my undergraduates 20 years ago, we didn't talk about identity crime, right? Or stuff like that. But again, I love the sort of the attitude that you're instilling in your students and listeners is just be on the lookout and don't be static, be dynamic. We talk about risk factors falling into either static risk factors or dynamic risk factors. But yeah, your outlook should be dynamic.
Always. That was well said. Don't be static, be dynamic. I'm doing my takeaways too. I'm taking notes for the classroom.
Yes,
Joe, I'm going to give you credit.
Thank you. I appreciate you.
I promise.
Debbie, thank you so much. I hope this is not the last time we speak. I am going to continue to devour your content as I was doing last night. I listened to the media one. I should add, Debbie, if there are any resources or tools or links that you would like me to pass on to my viewers and listeners, send those to me and I will embed those within the show notes. So things like the website to Crime Time with Debbie or any other media links or resources that you think the listeners would appreciate. Get those to me. And dear listener, like I said, those will be embedded in the show notes. Dr. Debbie, I can't wait until we connect again. Take care.
It's been a pleasure, Joe. Thank you. And you're going to have a big following in Florida. I'm going to tell all my students to tune into the Criminologist Podcast.
I so appreciate that. Thanks a lot, Debbie. All right. Take care. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
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 Thank you, Dr. Debbie Goodman, for helping us move beyond the headlines and think more carefully about how crime is understood, discussed, and represented. Today's conversation reminds us that serious cases deserve more than just fascination. They require context, ethical judgment, respect for victims and survivors, and a willingness to resist simple explanations for complex human behavior. For those who would like to learn more about Dr. Debbie Goodman and her work, I will include links in the show notes to her website, Crime Time with Dr. Debbie, as well as her LinkedIn profile for those of you looking to connect. As always, thank you for joining me on the Criminologist Podcast. Continue learning, continue questioning, and continue helping our profession tell more responsible and informed stories about crime and justice. This is Joseph Arvidson. Thank you for listening. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
It becomes hard to understand how could, and you mentioned Rex Huberman, and thank you, but how could an architect, a husband, a father who's seemingly, well-adjusted and a part of society, kill 8 people? So I think these are the moments in time when we could be thoughtful, when we could be compassionate and considerate, because that's another key part, Joe. We understand that people are so fascinated by the killers, but I never want to lose sight of the victims and the victimology.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, training opportunities, program design, or interview requests, visit theparagongroup.llc.com. To learn more about the TIDES supervision model, a trauma-informed, desistance-based approach to community supervision, please visit the TIDESLLC.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to check out the Criminologist YouTube channel for additional content, including exclusive video interviews and international insights. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star review. And as always, thank you for listening.